The federal government has been urging Canadians not to travel. Now they're preparing to back that call up with as yet unnamed new measures to discourage trips abroad. The Primetime panel is back to discuss this latest COVID strategy. The Globe and Mail's Laura Stone, Zane Velji, campaign strategist and partner at North Weather, and Raywat Deonandan, epidemiologist and associate professor at the University of Ottawa. Raywat Deonandan, I'm going to start with you. How big a factor is travel in the increased spread of COVID-19?
It's uncertain. There's a statistic that's often bandied about that travel is responsible for 2% of transmission. That doesn't sound like a lot, but 2% of a very large number is a very large number. And a very large chunk of transmission is not contact traced thoroughly. And so it could be much larger than 2%. So an important thing to remember is that pretty much 100% of COVID cases around the world, with the exception of those in Wuhan, China, are the result somewhere down the transmission chain of travel from somewhere. So the countries that have done well with COVID all have three things in common. One, they acted hard and early. Two, they got really good at case detection. And three, they hardened their borders against reinfection via travel. So I think controlling travelers is pretty important.
When you make a compelling case like that, I mean, one thing that question pops to my mind is like, well, why haven't we done more about this sooner? But let's talk about what we could do as well. Raywat Deonandan, what would you like to see in terms of measures?
Well, of course, we have the mandatory quarantine. In force would be nice. Requiring a negative PCR test before you come would be nice. Mind you, there is a black market for negative PCR tests, believe it or not. That can be overcome. Having rapid testing on site would be nice as well for incoming travelers. And rapid testing isn't perfect, but it's something. Having quarantine hotels that we can send travelers to that's monitored by public health would be good. And most importantly, follow-up. So right now, we haven't got the resources or the attention to follow up with incoming travelers. You give them a pamphlet, you tell them, hey, if you have symptoms, self-isolate. But it'd be nice if people got a call to figure out where they are. And also for essential travelers like truck drivers, military diplomats, they're not really monitored as well as I think they could be. And it'd be nice if we, again, followed up with them and applied rapid tests several times in a row. That would help a lot.
Do you think we have the resources, the bodies to do some of those things right now?
It's a good question. The rapid tests, we don't have enough of them, but we could get them. Everything else is a function, I think, of will and imagination. We're not a poor country, really. It's a matter of redirecting resources where you want to redirect them.
Okay. Laura, I want to bring you in here because we know Doug Ford has been talking about airports, certainly, in the last couple of months. We know François Legault has called for stricter measures. So what do you make of this and when we look at what the premiers have been saying?
Well, I did kind of feel like I was in a time machine today back to March 2020 as well, thinking that this is an announcement that probably should have and could have come a lot earlier. And I know that the premiers, particularly Mr. Ford here in Ontario, has been pushing for rapid testing at airports, for instance. And that's something that Ontario did on its own as part of a voluntary program. But I think that that Canada's moves on this front have been pretty slow. The 2% figure of travelers, that's been downplayed seemingly until now by the federal government, that travel is responsible for just a small part of spread. And now it seems like the government is doing a bit of a 180 here and really clamping down. I think this message probably could have been sent over the holidays when half the Alberta cabinet and Ontario's former finance minister and a bunch of other Liberal politicians traveled outside of the country and then faced consequences for that. So I think the most difficult thing here is going to be the timing. We have vaccines arriving. There's obviously challenges with that. But people are looking towards the future. They're looking towards life getting back to normal. And then they're also getting this message of a complete clampdown at the border. And so I guess it will be kind of challenging to see how much Canadians are really on board with that at this time.
Yeah, it was interesting to hear the Prime Minister today talk about spring break and don't make plans for spring break. And you're just thinking, who, at this stage of the game, my goodness, who is doing that? But at the same time, we saw over the holidays, right? It's not just everyday Canadians, it's people making policy who are making those choices. You talked about vaccines, though, and I want to bring Zane in to talk about that, because another thing that the premiers have been pressing the federal government on is the supply of vaccines. We're now getting no new doses of the Pfizer vaccine next week. The Moderna vaccine, if I understand correctly, it only gets delivered every 3 weeks, and it's not next week. So no new vaccines in Canada at all next week. Here's what the Prime Minister had to say about that today.
The current momentary delay is so that they can increase their production overall going forward. I'll also add that we'll get almost 500,000 Moderna doses in February, too. We're working around the clock to get as many vaccines as we can, as fast as we can. It's what I'm thinking about when I wake up in the morning, when I go to bed, and every hour in between.
Zane, what do you think of that response from the Prime Minister?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something he had to say, that this is top of mind all the time. It's all consuming to him. You know, this government has, you know, outside of a few hiccups, has had a relatively, I don't know if I could call it error-free, but done a pretty good job on this pandemic. And I think the downstream consequences of not having vaccines this week could be quite significant. And I think they lie both in the public health and the political angle. On the public health side, we're not, you know, going to hit the numbers that we perhaps wanted to hit by May. And certainly, you know, I think the Prime Minister is saying by September we'll get to where we need to get to. But the reason I kind of bring up the political side is I think largely the Trudeau government, you know, worst known secret for many folks is thinking about when an election period may want to happen, knowing that there really isn't a penalty for doing an election, as we've seen thus far from recent proof points in BC and otherwise during, you know, a pandemic. But they may now actually want to retreat from that, knowing that this vaccine file isn't going as well. You know, we've talked about this on the show before, that we're actually excellent at procuring and not great at distribution. Well, turns out now we've got the problem around procurement that's making us fall down. And this is compounded with the story a couple of weeks ago where we had the procurement minister say that Canada did not need additional doses of Moderna because we were more than well equipped. And so if this turns out to be a referendum on Justin Trudeau, and more specifically a referendum on the last thing you have done for me, i.e. vaccines, they may be reconsidering even the timing of an election simply because they don't want the sour taste in people's mouths, let alone the fact that this is the government that put out CERB and CEWS and all the supports early and often and well executed. But it's the vaccines. And if you fall down on what you've done recently, you actually lose that ability to perhaps use that as leverage and ammunition heading into an electoral period. So political consequences here could be quite significant if we see a story like this. And if this is what we're talking about next week, no new doses next week, et cetera, I mean, this could be a real problem for the Trudeau government in that regard.
Raywat, Zane gave us the political take there. Give us the epidemiological take on all this. How do you think we're doing when it comes to vaccines in this country?
Well, we're doing better than some and worse than others. We're doing better than Germany and France, strangely, but not as well as Israel, who's the leader. Mm-hmm. And from my side, the three rate-limiting steps to our vaccine rollout plan are the immutable laws of the vaccines themselves, the cold chain storage, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Then there's the strategic nature of our rollout plan, which has its flaws. And lastly is supply. Supply is the most important thing. In absence of supply, it really is more dire now for us to clamp down on transmission because the threat of the new variants is real and scary. And so we have to prevent those from taking root and becoming the dominant strains until we can vaccinate our most vulnerable.
We've only got a moment left, but Raywat Deonandan, I just want to ask you about UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson saying that the UK variant may now be more deadly. It's a tough topic to condense, but what are your thoughts?
It's scary. So if 1,000 people get the current variant, about 1% or 10 are expected to die. With the new, if in fact this is 30% more lethal, that means those 1,000 people, now 13 will die. Doesn't sound like a big difference, but if several thousand get it, now dozens more will die. And this is 56% more transmissible, so now scores more will die. It is deeply concerning.
An unfortunate note to end it on, but we appreciate everybody's insights today. Thank you to the Prime Time panel, and a special thank you to Raywat Deonandan. Power and Politics will be back right after this.